I spent $43,000 putting a down payment on a house for my son and his wife. $43,000 I had saved over 11 years. Money, I told myself, I was setting aside for something meaningful. And I meant it when I handed them that check. I meant every single dollar. 6 weeks after they moved in, my daughter-in-law Serena changed the garage code and told me I needed to call ahead before coming over. It was their house, she said. She needed boundaries. I stood in my driveway that afternoon, holding a casserole dish my wife Pauline had made. Her beef stew, the kind Marcus had been eating since he was 7 years old. And I thought about the look on Marcus's face when I'd handed him that check. He'd hugged me, squeezed my shoulder, said, "Dad, I don't know what to say." I told him he didn't have to say anything, that's what fathers do. I should have known something was off the first time I met Serena. Not because she was unpleasant, she wasn't, not exactly. She was polished in a way that felt deliberate, every sentence measured, every compliment followed by a small qualification. The first time she came to Sunday dinner at our house, she looked around the living room and said, "This is so cozy, it has that old school charm." She smiled when she said it. Pauline smiled back. I watched my wife spend the rest of the evening subtly adjusting throw pillows. Serena came from money. Not family money, really. Her parents weren't wealthy, but she'd grown up around it. Her college roommate's family had a place in the Hamptons. She'd interned at a firm in Manhattan. She had opinions about neighborhoods and kitchen finishes, and the difference between builder's-grade cabinets and custom millwork. These are not bad things to know about, but there's a version of that kind of knowledge that's informative, and there's a version that turns into a ruler you hold up against everything and everyone. Marcus was 31 when he met her. He worked in project management for a logistics company. Steady job, good salary, not extravagant. He'd been renting an apartment in Charlotte for 6 years and had about $12,000 in savings. Serena worked in marketing. She made decent money, maybe slightly more than Marcus. Together they were comfortable, but in Charlotte's housing market, comfortable gets you to the edge of what you can afford and stops. They'd been together 2 years when they started talking about buying. Serena had a neighborhood in mind. Actually, she'd had the neighborhood in mind for longer than that. She mentioned it the second time we met, casually, the way people mention things they've already decided. Myers Park, old trees, wide lots, brick houses with front porches and detached garages. Beautiful neighborhood. Also, not cheap. Even with their combined income, a house there required a down payment that was going to take them years to accumulate. I don't know exactly when the idea formed in my head. Maybe it was gradual. Maybe it was the afternoon Marcus called me, sounding defeated, because a house they'd loved went under contract before they could move on it. He didn't ask me for anything. He was just venting, but I heard something in his voice I recognized. The particular frustration of a man who is working hard and still feeling like he's falling behind, and I couldn't let it sit. I talked to Pauline about it that night. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "If we do this, we do it because we want to, not because we expect anything back." I told her I knew that. She said, "I mean it, Dennis. Once it's given, it's given." I told her I understood. We had the money. My father had passed 4 years earlier and left me a portion of the sale of his property in South Carolina. It had been sitting in a high-yield account. I'd been undecided about what to do with it, put it toward our own retirement, help with Marcus's college loans, renovate the kitchen. In the end, the decision felt clear. My father was a man who believed in setting his children up. It seemed right to pass that along. I called Marcus and told him we wanted to help with the down payment. He got very quiet. Then he said, "Dad, I can't let you do that." I said, "You're not letting me do anything. I'm telling you we want to." He asked me how much. I said $43,000, which was what they needed to hit 20% on a house in the price range they'd been looking at. He cried. My 31-year-old son, who played varsity baseball and once drove through a hurricane to get home from college, cried on the phone. I told him to stop it. He laughed. We both did. The house they found was on a corner lot, 3 bedrooms, built in 1948 with the original hardwood floors, and a kitchen that had been updated sometime in the early 2000s. Good bones, Marcus said. Serena said it had potential. It went under contract in 4 days. Pauline and I attended the closing, sat across the table as Marcus and Serena signed their names to every page. Serena's parents weren't there. Her mother, Jeanette, had sent flowers with a card that said, "Congratulations on your new beginning." Her father, Owen, had texted Marcus a handshake emoji. Pauline squeezed my arm during the signing. I remember thinking, this is what it's for. The savings, the patience, the years of working and not spending and telling yourself, there's a reason you're being careful. This is the reason. We helped them move in on a Saturday in October. Me, Marcus, my brother-in-law Ed, and Marcus's friend from college whose name I always mangle. Serena's friend Kayla came and mostly directed traffic. Serena herself was organizing boxes in the kitchen. At one point, I carried a heavy bookcase up a flight of stairs by myself because Marcus was on a call and I didn't want to interrupt. When I set it down in the office, Serena came in, looked at where I'd placed it, and said it needed to be on the other wall. I moved it. She looked at it again and said actually the first position was probably better. I moved it back. She left without saying thank you. I told myself that was nothing. People are stressed on moving days. The first few months were fine. We'd have dinner together every couple of weeks. Marcus seemed happy. Genuinely happy, the easy kind, not the kind a person performs. He and Serena were decorating slowly, making decisions together about furniture and paint colors. He'd text me photos of progress, a new light fixture, the backyard after they'd raked it for the first time. Serena was cordial with me. With Pauline, she was warmer. They had a thing about cooking shows they'd watch together sometimes. But with me, there was always something slightly formal, a carefulness that I told myself was just her personality. Some people are like that with in-laws. I didn't push. The garage code thing happened in December, about 6 weeks after move-in. I'd come over unannounced, which, yes, I know is a thing you should discuss. Because Pauline had made extra stew, and Marcus had mentioned he'd been working long hours and I figured he'd appreciate a hot meal. I had my own code. Or I thought I did. I punched it in. Nothing. Tried again. Nothing. I rang the front doorbell. Serena answered. She looked surprised, then composed herself quickly. She thanked me for the food, took the dish, and said she hoped I hadn't driven far out of my way. I said it was no trouble. She said they'd been meaning to reach out about visiting, that she thought it would be good for everyone if they moved to a schedule. More predictable, she said. Less intrusive. She used the word intrusive. I drove home and didn't say anything to Pauline for about 20 minutes. Then I told her what happened. She got very still. She said, "Did Marcus know about the code?" I said I didn't know. She said, "You should ask him." I said I wasn't going to put Marcus in the middle of it. She said I was probably right. I asked Marcus about it, eventually. Not directly. I brought it up sideways, mentioned I'd stopped by and the code hadn't worked. He paused. Then he said they'd had a security update and they'd forgotten to give me the new one. He gave it to me right then over the phone. I said thank you. He said of course. Neither of us said what we were actually talking about. Here's the thing about a situation like that. Every individual piece of it is deniable. The code gets changed. Okay, that happens. She asks for scheduled visits. Okay, that's a reasonable preference. She doesn't say thank you when I move furniture. Okay, she was stressed. Taken one at a time, you can explain away almost anything. It's only when you start to see the pattern that it becomes impossible to ignore. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. Spring came. Marcus and Serena had been in the house about 8 months. They had people over for a housewarming party. Yes. 8 months in, I know it was delayed. I think because they spent several months debating what to do with the living room. Pauline and I arrived at 6. There were maybe 30 people there, a mix of their friends, a few of Serena's work colleagues, and Serena's parents, Jeanette and Owen. I'd met them twice before, once at the engagement dinner, once briefly at the closing. Owen was a genial guy, easy to talk to, the kind of man who laughs loudly at his own jokes. He found me early in the evening and told me the house had turned out beautifully. I said I thought so too. He lowered his voice, almost conspiratorial, and said, "We really appreciate what you and your wife did." That was something. I said it was our pleasure. He clapped me on the shoulder. Then he drifted away, and that was the extent of the conversation. Jeanette spent most of the evening in the kitchen with Serena. They'd brought an elaborate charcuterie board and a bottle of wine that Serena made a point of showing to several guests. At some point I overheard Jeanette telling someone that the crown molding in the dining room had been her suggestion. As far as I knew, that was not true. But I let it go. At the end of the evening, Serena gave a little toast. She thanked everyone for coming, talked about what the house meant to her, how she'd always dreamed of a place like this. She thanked her parents. She thanked her friends. She thanked everyone who helped make this possible. She looked in my direction when she said that, a brief inclusive glance, the kind you give a crowd. Not my name, not a specific acknowledgement, just everyone. Pauline caught my eye from across the room. I shook my head slightly. She looked down at her glass. The drive home was quiet. At a red light, Pauline said, "She didn't mention you." I said I'd noticed. Pauline said, "She mentioned her mother's charcuterie board." I said yes, she had. Pauline said, "We gave them $43,000. I said I knew. We didn't say much else. I made a decision that night. Not an angry decision. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't planning revenge, wasn't running through scenarios, wasn't rehearsing speeches. I made a quiet, private decision that the generous chapter of this particular story was over. I would still be Marcus's father. I would still show up for my son, but I was done being a resource for Serena. I didn't tell Marcus. I didn't tell Serena. I kept showing up for dinners. I kept being pleasant. I kept everything exactly as it had been on the surface, because the surface was fine. I hadn't been insulted publicly. I hadn't been spoken to rudely. Nothing had happened that I could point to and say, "There, that's the thing." It was just the accumulation, the pattern, the clear, slow revelation of what I was and wasn't to this woman. The test came 3 months later. Marcus called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. We usually talked on weekends. He said he and Serena had been doing some research, and they were thinking about converting the basement. Finish it out, add a bathroom, maybe a spare bedroom. He said they'd gotten a few quotes, and the numbers were coming in around 28 to 35,000. Then he paused. The pause said everything. I let it sit for a moment. I said, "That sounds like a good project. Have you been saving for it?" He said they had some money set aside, not enough for the whole thing. I said, "How much are you short?" He said probably 15 to 20,000. I said, "Have you talked to a home equity line of credit? With what you've built up over the last year and what we put in at the start, you should have decent equity by now." He said they'd thought about it. Then he said, "We were wondering if you and Mom might want to contribute." I said, "Marcus, I love you, but your mother and I aren't in a position to do that right now." There was a pause. He said, "Oh, okay." I said, "A home equity line really is worth looking into. Rates have been better than expected." He said, Yeah, you're right. We'll figure it out." We talked for a few more minutes about his job and some family stuff, and then we hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after, not feeling guilty, feeling, if I'm honest, something close to relief. We were not, for the record, in a difficult financial position. Pauline has a pension. I had recently retired from 30 years in civil engineering and had retirement accounts that were doing fine. We were not struggling. Marcus knew this, broadly. Serena definitely knew it. But here's what I'd learned. The thing that took me most of that year to fully understand. Generosity that goes unacknowledged doesn't teach gratitude. It teaches expectation. Every time you give without being thanked, you're not building a relationship, you're building a precedent. And I'd built a pretty significant precedent with that first $43,000. 3 weeks after that phone call, Serena called me directly. She almost never called me directly. Usually everything came through Marcus, or, occasionally, through Pauline. She was friendly on the phone, warmer than usual, actually, which I noticed. She asked about my golf game. She asked about a home improvement project I'd mentioned at Easter. Then she said she wanted to talk to me about the basement. She'd done a lot of research, she said. She knew a contractor, very reputable, had done work in the neighborhood. She thought this would really add value to the house. She said the word investment more than once. Then she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "I know you and Marcus already did so much for us, but this would be such a meaningful contribution to our family's future." Our family's future. I thought about the toast at the housewarming party, the parking code, the bookcase, the word intrusive, The charcuterie board that got a specific thank you while I got a glance in a crowd. I said, Serena, I appreciate you calling. I said the same thing to Marcus. I think a home equity line of credit is really the right move here. You've got the equity. It's a straightforward process. She said, but the interest. I said, it's deductible. On a home improvement, it often makes more sense than a cash gift anyway. She was quiet. I said, we're rooting for you both. I hope the project comes together the way you're imagining it. She thanked me. Her voice had gone careful again. We said goodbye. She did not call me directly again after that. The basement project happened, eventually. They took out a home equity line. It took them longer to get started than they'd planned, and they scaled back the scope a bit. One large finished room instead of the bedroom addition. Marcus sent me a photo when it was done. Looked good. I told him so. He seemed proud. Things shifted after that, but not dramatically. Serena was cooler with me, in the particular way of someone who'd made a calculation and found it hadn't worked out. Not rude, just efficient. The warmth she'd occasionally performed in my direction became less frequent, which was fine. Honest, even. I'd rather have honest efficiency than performed warmth. What changed most was Marcus. Slowly, and then more quickly, in the way those things tend to go. I noticed him making small comments, not about Serena directly, just observations, a kind of subtle recalibration. He called more often, came by himself a few times without Serena, just to sit at the kitchen table and talk the way we used to. Once during one of those visits, he said to me, out of nowhere, Dad, do you like Serena? I looked at him. I said, I love you, Marcus. I want you to be happy. He nodded slowly. He said, that's not quite what I asked. I said, I know. We sat with that for a while. I'm not going to tell you how the rest of Marcus's story goes, because it's still going. What I will tell you is that he called me last spring and said he and Serena were in couples counseling. He said it had been going on for a few months, that there were things they'd been working through. He sounded tired but not defeated. He said, I've been thinking about a lot of things. About what I've let go by without saying anything. I didn't ask him to be more specific. He knew I'd understood. What I want to say, to anyone in a similar situation, anyone who's written a check, or showed up with a moving truck, or let themselves be the quiet, reliable, uncomplaining foundation that someone else built their life on, is this. There is a version of generosity that is love, and there is a version that is avoidance. Real love sometimes means handing your child exactly what they need, but it also sometimes means not handing them the thing that removes all friction, because friction is where people learn who they are. I don't regret the $43,000. Not 1 cent of it. I gave it to my son, and Marcus is my son. But I learned something in the year that followed that I should have known earlier. When you give something significant, you find out very quickly what the people around you actually think of you. Not what they say, what they think. The toast that doesn't include your name, the code that gets changed, the call that comes through your son first and then, when that doesn't work, comes directly to you, with a story about investment and family futures. People reveal themselves. You just have to be willing to see it. I picked up the phone when Marcus called that spring. I always pick up when Marcus calls. I told him I was proud of him for being in that room, doing that work, asking the hard questions. He said he'd learned something from me about that, about being patient and watching, and not reacting until you understood the whole picture. I said I wasn't sure I'd always gotten that right. He said, no, but you got it right when it mattered. That's enough for me. That's more than enough.